I have a question for you, and it's going to sound like kind of a loaded question, but do you suppose Idaho voters could be persuaded to vote for brighter chains for themselves? We're going to talk about ranked choice voting and how it can persuade people to actually increase their own enslavement by giving them the illusion of this is what you want. After all, you voted for it. We'll get to it right after this.
Press club or bias all media, newspaper, radio.
To be completely blunt here, Brian, and there are plans to expand
indoctrination.
That's right.
Well, Idahoans are also concerned.
Horror shot.
That line would be moving a little bit farther west.
I'm like crying.
Nobody wants to see
dark money is influencing policy in our state.
Well, that's not how this works.
Once again, welcome to Nowhere to Hide. I'm Brian Hyde. Twice a week, I have a chance to sit down and go over some of the issues that crop up from time to time here in the great state of Idaho, and hopefully give them a little more thorough coverage, or at least a little more nuance than what you'll find in much of the mainstream media. And by the way, mainstream media right now is feeling pretty good about this headline. Check this out. Idaho Supreme Court dismisses AG's challenge to open primary ballot initiative. Now, look at that subheadline, though, because this tells you the rest of the story. And in case you're thinking, well, there you have it. The Attorney General, had filed suit and was trying to get the ballot initiative for open primaries, ranked choice voting thrown out. Well, actually, the court dismissed that legal challenge on procedural grounds, and they did leave a couple of ways by which it can be remedied. So this is from the press release from the Idaho Supreme Court. This is from Justice Robin M. Brody. In the opinion, Brody wrote, "Today, the Idaho Supreme Court dismisses the Attorney General's petition on procedural allegations of fraud and of signatures in the initiative process are serious. Those allegations, however, must first be adjudicated in court in the first instance." So there's the procedural violation. He should have gone to the district court in the first place, instead skipped over them and went to the Idaho Supreme Court. The Attorney General's petition fundamentally misapprehends the role of this court under the Idaho Constitution and the role of the Secretary of State under the initiative laws enacted by the Idaho legislature. Now, I know that initiative proponents are they're portraying this as a slam dunk. It's a done deal. We're going to get ranked choice voting. It's going to pass by an overwhelming margin, and it might. I don't know. Voters can be pretty easy to fool. But here's the rest of the story, okay? Here's the other shoe dropping. The Idaho Supreme Court said it would not weigh in on Labrador's allegation that the ballot initiative violates the Idaho Constitution's single subject requirement unless voters approve it. In other words, if the voters approve it, then they're standing to take it before the Idaho Supreme Court and say, okay, it got on the ballot, but instead of just one thing, it actually presented two issues instead of the single it was supposed to. So they say that issue will not be ripe for review unless and until Idaho voters approve the initiative at the general election in November. That's what Brody wrote in Tuesday's opinion. So that lady is not saying that yet. Is that insensitive to say? Okay, the calorically challenged woman has yet sounded the final notes of, but even if this thing does pass, and look, I'll concede simply because there are a lot of voters out there who are very easily led by promises and slick talk and snake oil, and they're being told, hey, finally your voice is going to matter, finally your voice is going to be heard. But what they're not hearing is how the process of voting is going to be perverted and complicated to the point that their vote may not count as much as it did before. Get into this. Let's hear at another possible response. Let's say that ranked choice voting or open primaries, as they sold it, does pass. Well, here's what Senator Brian had to say. He says, well, if it does pass, I'll be first in line to repeal it. Maybe a legislative remedy. Boom, roasted. He did take a little bit of pleasure in that. So I want to share with you some thoughts here from Christy Zito about ranked choice voting and jungle primaries. Now, if you haven't heard of the term jungle primary, this refers to essentially it's a primary election where it's not done by party. It's just basically it's a free-for-all, kind of like what California did, if you remember a few years ago, back when Arnold Schwarzenegger survived the primary and actually became the governor of California. I mean, you saw porn star Mary Carey and a whole host of others, probably 24 different people, and it just split the vote so many different ways. And I don't know if people would say that Schwarzenegger was a good governor or not, but it does kind of open some very interesting possibilities. And more than anything, it waters down the conservative people in Idaho and waters down their voices, which is really the whole intent. Now, Christy Zito says the organization that pushed for the initiative deceived the voters when they were gathering signatures. So when they were gathering signatures from Idaho voters, the organizers were pitching open primaries. That's what they said. But this statement is untrue because this initiative is to implement a top 4 primary. This is the ranked choice voting part of it. Folks were told this primary system would allow everyone to vote on who would be on the ballot come November. Now, signers of the petition were told they could participate in the party primary of their choice without affiliation to that party. However, this ballot initiative wouldn't open the primary nominating process, as all nominees will go on the same ballot no matter which party they choose to represent, if any. And the top 4 will advance to the November election. So, for example, there could be 4 Democrats, 4 Republicans, 3 Democrats, 1 Republican, 3 Republicans, and 1 Democrat. There could be any combination. This is the type of voting system that will create a California-style jungle primary system. In addition to this convoluted disaster, Christy Zito says we will be in a ranked choice voting system, meaning when the voters go to the polls in November in the general elections, in this system, voters will no longer be voting for one person they choose to represent them. In other words, they will force the voters to rank all of the candidates in order of preference. Now, what this means is if you have to vote for someone you don't like, in other words, you have to pick a second or third choice. If you don't vote for that person you don't want to represent you, then you risk your ballot being thrown out if there is a runoff for that race. She concludes by saying Proposition 1 will cause deception and lack of integrity in elections. It will cause delayed election results, and for good reason. It complicates things. Secretary of State Phil McGrain says it will cost $40 million to implement just for the voting machines. And then we have the matter of Alaska, which passed ranked choice voting here a few years ago. Now they are desperately trying to get out of ranked choice voting. They saw a 328% increase in lower vote in cost, and also they saw lower voter turnout, increased ballot spoilage. This is the part about if you don't rank, the candidates that you really don't want to vote for, your vote won't be counted. It'll be thrown out. In other words, we're setting up a system that if you want to cast your vote for a person, but you don't also cast a vote for the people you really don't want, in other words, rank them in order of preference, the system cannot abide your dissent and will throw your ballot out. Just like if you write in somebody, who's not on the ballot, sorry, we can't recognize that. Isn't that convenient? Doesn't that seem like a good way to make sure that the system can be gamed properly if someone chooses? Christie warns this will make Idaho more like California and New York. And Proposition 1, she says, will open the floodgates for radical left-wing lawmakers to take over and execute their leftist, Marxist agenda. Now, look, they're not going to be obvious about it in the sense that, boy, the day we get in, the hammer and sickle is going right up the flagpole. But it's very clear they want to blunt the influence of conservative legislators. And by the way, we've had a pretty nice run, at least through the primary season. We have a much more conservative influence going into the upcoming legislative session here in Idaho, which means there's a very real chance we'll see some things like school choice, among other things, have a fighting chance. Now, having said that, here's the question I'd like you to ask yourself. Do you really stop and vet the candidates and the issues to the point that you would recognize if someone was trying to encourage you to cast a vote so that you can have brighter chains? Because that's really what you're being asked to do. And I know people don't like to hear terms like low information voters, but I just want to point this out. As insensitive as it may sound, the masses are far easier to fool than people who have taken the time to really vet the issues and vet the candidates, which is, that's on you. That's on me. That's on each one of us every time we go to stand in that voting booth. If you've ever stood there going, oh man, I don't really recognize this name, or I don't recognize this issue, and you kind of wet your finger and put it up into the wind to see which way the wind is blowing. Well, how do I feel about this? You're not acting as a fully informed voter. You're acting under low information. Ranked choice voting is only going to encourage that even more. And again, it's that brilliance of, well, but we're convincing people now, we're making your voice matter more than ever, even as they water down the impact of your vote, which is much more influential in a closed primary system because you can more closely align with those who actually share your values rather than having to rank, well, okay, if I can't have this one, then I'll at least, vote for this pile of garbage instead. Okay, well, that's the vote we're going to count if, your person doesn't get a majority vote. Anyway, so let's look at the bright side. What are some of the good things that could be happening in the days ahead? Well, let's turn to Idaho Freedom Action as well as Idaho Freedom Foundation. These are just a few of the agendas that they are going to be focusing on in the upcoming legislative session. These are some of the policy priorities. Universal education choice, meaning money should follow the student so parents can choose education opportunities best meeting their children's needs. This is one of the reasons why, by the way, the open primaries people are pushing so hard. They do not want to see this kind of thing happen. Also, grocery tax repeal and property tax relief, eliminating wokeness in education. Public schools should teach children the ABCs, not the LGBTQs. Higher education should equip graduates with marketable skills free from indoctrination. Have you noticed the shift? If you've been paying attention, you have. If you haven't noticed it, well, go back to sleep. They'll wake you up when they're ready to indoctrinate you. Also, there will be a focus on addressing illegal immigration. Where the federal government fails, the state has to step up. And welfare for illegals. Use every tool to enforce immigration laws. Illegal immigration is a threat to Idaho's security and prosperity. Why does it get a free pass sometimes? Well, that cheap labor is very tempting to big businesses like some of the bigger members of IACI. Also, advancing sound money. This is a huge one. Federal policies have devalued the dollar, costing families dearly. So let's focus on policy that allows Idahoans tax-free use of crypto, gold, and silver to protect against inflation. And then, of course, spending responsibly. Idaho's budget has grown 55% through the last 5 years. Lawmakers must restrain spending in every area to reduce government's burden on families. And there's a little bit more here, too, about accountability. Additionally, IFF and IFA will continue to promote the following to make Idaho lawmakers and agencies accountable to the people. Government transparency and accountability. Idaho Freedom Foundation will continue its excellent work in making sure government agencies report their activities and costs and hold them to account for any violations, misspending, or malfeasance. Also, legislator accountability. The Idaho Freedom Index, long recognized as the gold standard for state-based legislative scorecards, now includes a new metric on protecting families and traditional values of Western society. Legislators' Freedom Index scores reflect their votes on all bills in this regard. And it's a great way to say, okay, but their words said this, but their actions showed this. No hiding behind words at this point. You can see clearly what their actions showed. Then there's collaboration with other family groups. IFF and IFA look forward to building coalitions with other advocacy groups in the state, together with partners committed to protecting families and promoting traditional values. We can be stronger than each going it alone. Yeah, this is one of the things that, I know there's sometimes that question of purity. Are you as conservative as I am? And it may be time to adjust your expectations to the point that you don't insist on absolute purity, but rather look for the people who are, mostly on board with the same values that you hold. The purity thing has a tendency to make the perfect the enemy of the good. Well, in this case, there are a lot of enemies of freedom that are counting on us to sit there and snipe at each other rather than to address the issues by setting aside those differences and forming coalitions with people who likewise aren't willing to vote for brighter chains, but actually want government restricted and limited to its proper role, keeping its boot off of our neck and staying out of our way so that we can prosper and thrive. It's really that simple. Now, does it involve a little bit of effort? Absolutely it does. Being informed is a big part of it. But you knew that going in as a voter, right? And if you've been a low information voter to this point, now's the time to resolve that you won't show up at the polls as a low information voter again. I'm Brian Hyde, and this is Nowhere to Hide.
The press club are biased all media, newspaper, radio.
To be completely blunt here, Brian, and there are plans to expand
indoctrination.
That's right.
Idahoans are also concerned.
Horror shot. That line would be moving a little bit farther west.